are launching and having chats about Anindita's book. I think the most polite way to begin is to read out the commitment reports and then we'll proceed. So here is the press of the University of Alberta, and we acknowledge that we are located on 26 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Mexican, Dakota Seals, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Sottos, Anishinaabe, and many others. Thank you so much. And we have three panelists with us here, and then the translator. Of course, we want to learn about them. And but let me just read the bio for us and introduce them in some way. From the left hand side, my left side, I will start with Professor Michael Odile, who is a professor in the Department of English and Film Studies, the Faculty of Art, and a government board member of the Child Fund Spoken Word Project. He works in the field of critical and cultural theories, material culture studies with a focus on poetry and poetics, archive theory, book history, petrocultures, and most recently, the study of sound, listening, and literary body text. Thank you, sir. And then followed by the writer in residence at EFS, Brian Fitzpatrick. He is a poet and critic currently moving between cities. His critical work centers on questions of spatial production, emergence, intimacy in contemporary poetics. He is also the current writer in residence in the University of Alberta. And then, to my side here also is Professor Odile Cisneros. Did I pronounce that?
Odile. Close enough.
Odile Cisneros. He's a professor at the Department of Modern Languages and Cultural Studies, a multilingual comparatist and translator. She has published on the historical and post-war literary avant-garde, Latin American poetry, Mexico and Brazil, and literary translation. She has translated the poetry of Reggie Bonficino, Haroldo de Campos, and Rodrigo de Rosa, and the Nobel laureate Jaroslav Seifert, among others. And then, in essence, we are going to read the bio of the poet, and then we'll end that with the bio of the translator. Mridul Dasgupta is a Bengali poet and journalist. Till now, he has published 6 books of poetry, more than a dozen essays, and has contributed significantly to children's literature. He has received the National Writers Award. He was subsequently presented with the Bangla Academic Award in 2000 and Rabindra Puraskar in 2012. Finally, the translator, Anindita Mukherjee. Anindita is a poet and translator. She is also a graduate student in EFS. Her first book, titled Nothing and Firations, was selected as the top 10 young Indian voices by Awakal Publishers. In 2024, she was also selected as a fellow for the Horizons Writers Circle. Please, can we welcome them with... So we are going to begin proper now, and we will start by asking the translator, and also a writer, of course, to introduce the reader to Dasgupta's poetry, and thereafter take it from there.
Yes. Thank you everyone for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce to the Anglophone world the works of Mridul Dasgupta, who I translated. So I think, for our interest, it's better if I read part of the introduction that I wrote, which will set up, who the reader is, but also about his work and about his poetics as well. So in the contemporary Bengali literary scene, Mridul Dasgupta is a prophet of figurative expression. His use of language and depiction of existential experiences are universal. The slow microscopic examination of self dilates to include society and politics. He makes no difference between the poet and the poet speaker. He has released poetry from the burden of a specific subject. He once pointed out to me saying that, "Ami bishoy kendrik kobita theke sore eshechi. I have moved away from subject-oriented poetry." In conceptualizing poetics as a field, we often place abstract thought and concrete thought at two poles, as if they are opposite extremes. But he weaves the meditations on art with a superabundance of emotions, transmitting impressions that cannot be quantified or localized. The language undergoes metamorphosis with the reader. He unearths the trance inherent in self-discovery, the strangeness of sleep, mysteries of love, and asks the questions of why people kill and how they look back when they cross borders. By reading Dasgupta, one may come close to reading surrealist poetry, but he claims to have never read the surrealists as such. He has crossed borders without leaving his writing desk. Those who read international poetry in translation may find Dasgupta mumbling in Robert Disnos's technique of automatism, lurking with Antonin Artaud's raw cosmologies of ancient cultures, or even getting lost with André Breton in contemplation. Or readers may be reminded of Giorgio di Ciro and how they are awakened in the panic of his thoughts, or remember Joseph Connell's diaries of dream sequences. I had the pleasure of meeting Prof. Dasgupta when I was selected for the writing residency that I went to, and we had very interesting conversations about poetry, and he was very surprised that someone would be really interested in translating his work, which he now calls the evening of his life, because he's already 70. So that's, and I had the pleasure of doing that, of working with him. He took very keen interest about my word choices, why I translated the way I translated. I went to meet him at his house, share a meal, and talk about poetry. So I'm here to talk in flesh and blood about the person I met to all of you.
All right. Thank you for that beautiful introduction, I believe. Yeah, so it's beautiful that you met someone whose work highly resonated with you, and you took on the project to push his work to Anglophone audience, right? So yeah, I'm actually waiting if you, the panelists will have some kind of impressions from the kind of, especially personally, I'm fascinated with the idea of writing, sitting by the desk, talking about borders without even leaving the desk. It's something for me, because how does one write about border without crossing the border? That's what it suggests. It's my main other thing for something, but that is what it suggests for me. So yeah, the floor is open to the panelists on, comment on the poet. Yeah, I want to say what perhaps maybe we have some thoughts about.
Okay, I'll go first then. Congratulations, first of all. It's very, this is very difficult poetry. That's what I'm gonna say. It's not an easy read. In some ways it is, in some ways it isn't. But I'll just, I have some notes that I took just with regards to some of the things that you say in this, in your introduction, and that just reminded me of things. So one of the things about this poetry is that it's completely unexpected. It's like turning a corner, and then you don't know what you're going to see next. There's nothing predictable about this poetry. So he doesn't use any, I don't think any forms that are, that are recognizable. He writes in lines. Okay, that's recognizable, I guess. but other than that, you know, the images themselves, very arresting. I find that you don't know what's coming next. So congratulations on, you know, on translating something that's quite hard. But something that you said in the introduction really struck me. You said, news is essentially poetry. And I was reminded of I think this is something that Ezra Pound said, that poetry is the news that stays news. You know? So this thing where, you know, no matter, you could be translating something from, you know, centuries ago, and if it's poetry, it's still gonna sound new, right? So that's what I would say. The other thing that I'd say is that I really, another thing about this is it's a poetry of flashes of insight. I think you said this. So it's not something where it's looking to build. In that respect, it seemed to me like a very postmodern poetry, right? There's not a sense of like, oh, I'm going to make this great proclamation, you know, about something profound, you know. And even if he does, at some point, he immediately undercuts it, you know. So I found that was fascinating. And the other thing I would say is also that I find that it's you know, recently I myself am a translator, and I'm completely, you know, sort of sympathize, you know, with the struggles of translation, and I think that you can think of translation also as a kind of gift or generosity. And I was very struck that, you know, this is the first time that this poet, who's in his 70s, is being translated, right, into English. And I was like, well, that is quite important, you know. I see translation as you want other people to appreciate this poetry that you appreciate, and people who don't speak Bengali. So I would say that there's a lot of that. Your own rendering of this is an act of generosity for you to be able to share that with audiences, and lending this poet your voice, so that he can have a voice beyond his, you know, language, beyond his context, beyond his culture. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I'll just add one thing about how he uses poetry. Is when he was beginning to, and this may be really important in the context of our discussions, that he was working as a teacher, but he never took a government job, even though that was, you know, something that he could really do that, because he wanted to write poetry. But he worked as a journalist much later. But there is a critique called Buddhadev Bose. So he once wrote that two things are detrimental to the life of a poet. The first is marriage, and the second is you know, working as a journalist, because you get so into this world of news and news making that you really don't get time to write poetry. But he had to support his family and take up a job as a journalist. But later, another poet called Vishnu Dev, he wrote that Shambad Mulokakabbo, which is news, is essentially poetry. So he took a lot of vigor from those words and again began his journey. It's quite, you know, comical, but also very interesting in a lot of aspects. Yeah.
Yes, it's my turn.
Yes.
Thanks first to all of you for coming. You could have done literally anything else on your Friday afternoon. And congratulations, Anindita, for publishing this book. I always know, like, I've been on both sides of book publishing and know it's kind of an ordeal to, like, not just write the book, but like then have to edit it and produce it. So
Yes.
you made it through, and this is the gravy now. I appreciated the chance to read how silkworms break their eggs and think my way through it, and the chance to think with all of you today about it. If you haven't seen the book, please consider buying it. So I have three kind of very broad questions. Really all I want is just to prompt you to say some things
Sure, yeah.
about the book and producing the book. So my first thing is, like, I picked up on the news thing too. So in her introduction, Anindita tells us that Dasgupta's slow microscopic examination of self dilates to include society and politics. I can feel this slide between the intimate and the social in Dasgupta's poems. At one corner of the third world, he positions, rescaling himself to set the pot on flame. Dasgupta's poems are filled with these intimate moments that nevertheless side-eye life at wider scales with its crisis and catastrophe and capital E events. The social hovers in the background of the poems. And I'm struck by the quote from the poet Vishnu Day that Anindita connects to Dasgupta's practice. News is essentially poetry. I agree with this. But I'm also reminded, and I feel like a total cliche for quoting this, but I'm going to do it anyway. The following very famous quote from William Carlos Williams. I think your quote is Pound. This is a different quote about poetry and news. That sometimes gets trotted out. And William Carlos Williams says, "My heart rouses, thinking to bring you news of something that concerns you and concerns many men. Look at what passes for the new. You will not find it there, but in despised poems. It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." So what's the relationship between news and poetry in Dasgupta's work? And interestingly, like enough that kind of like connection to journalism. We might frame his poetics as a kind of social poetics embedded in history, but with a complicated relationship to the news and the noise of the world. So my first question is like, how do you see Dasgupta's poetry as news? Do you want me to ask them one at a time, or do you want me to ask all three?
We can go one at a time. Whatever you please.
I don't care.
Since we're talking about news, so I may well finish that part and maybe go to the next. Yes. I was very interested. I actually recorded him, not on video but on audio, so that I can come back and listen to that. And this also ties to how I translated a lot of his poetry. You know, by using my ear mostly. Had to do that. When he said about his life, that news is essentially poetry, is not what Dasgupta says, but another poet, Vishnu Day, says from which he drew inspiration. But as someone living in this current world, I associated news, especially in the context of India, with fake news. Because that's all over, not only the internet, but also on television, which kind of gives us like a double denouement. We really don't know what is happening right there. I don't know if I think of Dasgupta's poetry as news, except for some of the snippets that he offers about when his parents crossed the border and came to India after 1947, but also some of his family members came after the Bangladesh war in 1971. So I see those news somewhat personalized. They're not news as we understand to be. It's not a scientific, news in a way. It's not, but it's kind of a historical understanding, or the Western, as we would say it in German. It's not the Erklärung. It's not scientific explanation, but it's kind of those snippets about life. And also he told me about one incident after which he wrote one of the some of the kitchen poems that are there in this collection. Is that when he used to work as a journalist, he wanted to come back home early, but he missed the last train to home. So he was there at the railway station and he saw a family of 3 dispossessed. So they didn't have a shelter over their head, but the mother, the father, and a little child, they were cooking rice on a makeshift oven. And that for him was the most poetic. It was a news in the sense it was never recorded. So he recorded the news that was not recorded by the news reporters. So that's my association with Dasgupta's poetry and news.
No, that's great. That's great. Do you want to jump in, Mike, or do you want me to keep going? Because I'll keep going.
Happily listen. Keep going.
Okay. My second question is shorter.
Okay.
My third question might want to jump in. I don't know. So I'm also interested in this book's status as selected poems. And I'm actually not sure. Did you select the poems?
Yeah.
Okay. That I can still ask this question, but it changes the question. So I find the genre of the selected poems super weird. It's like this weird kind of middle space because it works really well for poets who write individual poems, but a lot of poets write full books. And so partly I want to ask, where do you see Dasgupta fitting? Like, is he more individual, or are books like these full units? I imagine it's somewhere in between. That's the vibe I get from the book. It's seem more serial. But I also want to ask, selected poems are also weird because there's always things left out, because you have to make choices, right? And it's because the person doing the selected has their own interests and investments and their own version of what makes a poem good. So I'd love to hear you talk about, A, what you think this selected poems reveals about Dasgupta's work, but B, do you feel like there are any gaps? Was there anything that you noticed that left out, or couldn't find a way to include?
Yeah, thank you for this question. This is really interesting to think about choice. I think somewhere maybe in the lyric essay or the introduction, I have written that I didn't have like broader parameters guiding my choice, except what really stuck with my heart, and I followed it. And when I went with my makeshift manuscript, which was not really in the book, and so he read it, he said, yeah, I don't mind you. And he told me in the very first day that everything I wrote is poetry, and everything that I couldn't write, I have thrown them out, and they're no more my poetry. So it's upon you as a translator to choose whatever you want to do with my poetry. So I got that permission from him, and I used my discretion to do that. So I translated at least, more poetry than I could fit in here. So I have like a master manuscript which has more poetry than I could, because my publisher said, okay, 40 poems or 50 poems is good enough. But I had a conversation and stretched that to 75.
Yeah.
Because I thought that might be, that's a conversation about publishing. But he was, quite disheartened with me. For one thing, is that he had written 6 sonnet sequences that I translated, but couldn't put this in this book, especially for the first volume, which is, I think, the Olive Bodesraj. So there were 6 sonnet sequences that I couldn't put, and he wrote, publicly on social media about that that's the only thing that I could have included. But I did translate, but maybe when I was thinking about how many poems should go under each section, so that we get a wholesome picture. I didn't want to put a lot of attention on one book. Though I like the first collection a lot and leave out on others, which which kind of deserves attention. So I was treading on a very fine path. But I wish I could. Probably I'll translate that and put it in some magazine, but it couldn't find its space in this book. But having said that, I really do believe that my whole focus, I had a very ideated sense of audience from the very beginning, because this book is, it's not for people from, say, Bengal, because they would like to read it in Bengali, and why care about my translation anyway. So I had the Anglophone world and the audience there in my head, and I wanted to put out poetry that they might see in connection with other poets in the world. So when I was translating, I was also reading other poets, and I was thinking, how could they relate to this poetry? Because it's quite disjointed, the verse is very disjointed. But a lot has been left out. There are so many poems. One, he's publishing his 7th book of poetry, maybe in the next year.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's a lot that I have left out, and I live with this sense of loss and with me. Yeah.
I actually would love to jump in there, because I'm so curious about the sonnets, which for me would feel anomalous in terms of what is in this volume of poetry. Too conventionally traditional. Are they Shakespearean or Petrarchan sonnets, or is he messing with the sonnet form? How would you describe those?
Yes, so I think in India, and especially in Bengali poetry, there was a poet, Michael Madhusudhan Dotto. He was very influenced by the Elizabethan sonnet and the Petrarchan sonnet, and he wrote a lot of sonnet sequences, and I think that probably Dasgupta might have been influenced to write sonnet sequences, but they are neither Petrarchan nor Elizabethan. So they're his version of sonnet sequences, and I think he named them that. I don't remember it well, but no, they're not anything that the English world would think. And part of the reason why I didn't include it is I also felt that might be anomalous, because there are sonnet sequences, say 6 or 7 or maybe more, and that would be like a offbeat thing to put it in one collection, because I don't have something to compensate in other collections. It's a very, I think, a decision-making thing on my part that I left that out. I wish, I don't know what would have been otherwise, but yeah, that's.
do you mind if I pick up on this?
Yeah, please.
For a sec? Because, so I come to this without the linguistic, cultural, or historical expertise that could make me an informed contextualizer of Dasgupta's work. So I approached it on a formal basis. I thought about it the way a formalist might think of it. I attended to the ideas of form. And this goes to your notion of writing to an Anglo audience that might recognize connections to other poets in the world. So what I saw was the radical juxtaposition of disparate fragments, the use of parataxis, so disruptive syntax throughout, often the disavowal of a centering lyric consciousness, a practice of something like liminal gathering, so pulling things into the poem in a way that sometimes, as Odile was pointing out, those hard turns, right? That felt a little bit, had a kind of a mystical quality to it maybe, or had some kind of openness of the poet to bring things into the poem that perhaps weren't an effect of direct intention. A general disregard for imagery and metaphor. I mean, there are powerful images in there, but he's not he's not a tropological poet. He's not writing in like similes and metaphors and things like that. There's a very different approach to it. And also a kind of an ongoing distrust of his authorial self above and beyond the capacity of the reader to make meaning from the poem. And so I kind of brought those things together in my head, and I saw certain things. Would you read a poem that I think is a really good example of this?
Yeah, why not?
Okay, so
I think we should wait for the time when you want to read a poem, and then you can put that.
Yeah, for sure. But I can definitely, talk a little bit about what you were saying.
Yeah.
Because in one of the conversations that we had, and I think this was my very first interaction with me, and I was asking him, quite childishly, how did you get interested in poetry? Like, what was it about poetry that interested you? He said that he used to, as a child, he used to sit in his attic room and read poetry of Jibanananda Das, who is another great lyrical poet, probably. And what he used to do is to read as if he's rehearsing the lines. And one day it so happened that what he called সবুজ অন্ধকার আমার চোখের সামনে চলে এসেছিল, which means a green darkness opened in front of his eyes. And he understood that from that day he not only could write poetry, but he could embody poetry with his body and with his head. And I think that's the image that I feel can be associated with each and every poem that is there in this collection. Everything, some way or the other, is talking about that moment of inspiration, which is green darkness. I don't know how to explain green darkness or analyze green darkness and be so bloody disjointed, right? But they tell something to me. And as a practicing poet, I can feel him, and that I could also embody his voice in my head when I was translating that. So I do get what you're trying to say, this kind of liminal gathering of thoughts that are there in his poetry. And with this, I think we can read. I can read.
Yes, I want to read a bit of house rule because the time we have to manage the time so that we. So you next now is the fun part. We enjoy the poems, of course. 3 to 4, that's okay,
Yeah.
including the one you wanted to read initially, the one you wanted to jump in.
Oh yeah.
So,
Okay. Yes.
so that you can have opportunity. But the discussion, maybe each panelist can have 5 minutes to respond to your reading and impression of your
Or
reading.
maybe I can read them and then we can talk a little bit about.
Yes, you read you take the batch,
Yeah.
and then they can
For
respond.
sure.
Yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
why not? Okay, so the first poem that I read is called A Love Poem. And you'll see how it is everything but love. Okay? It's page 45. So, A Love Poem. Say, one day I muster a guerrilla squad, plunder palaces, parks, traders. After losing the arms and ammunition, when I take refuge in the last arrow, when amidst the smoke your lamenting face is loosened, evenly dazed, startled as you are, unsure yet willing, Consequently, I'll be caught, sent to the scaffold at dawn. That day, the new military agreement will dangle from the trees. You will meet your end. You too will meet your end. This country will forget our stories.
Thank you.
The second poem that I'll read is titled Hunger. Now in vain, you talk to the mirror in a language foreign. Still, hunger is measureless. To deliver religion, I bring the beef's brawn to the Hindu ethics. Zillions of wide-mouthed ravens. In dreams I fly. One day, like edibles, I will pass through as it were. I marvel at your tongue. Today, almost at the border's end, I see them moving along the religious gut, translatable, laughter, judgment. Needlessly, I ought to whiff the kitchen gas in the air. How fair is your curiosity? Did you see the page number? It's page 77. Okay, yeah, for sure, sorry. Okay, so the next poem that I'll read is page 91. It's titled The Way to Thinking. The way to thinking does not cross the tongue, yet the world is vulnerable. There are as many words as bosoms. At the prodigy's turmeric dip, I watched myself fall into a poetic cataclysm. This is the shade of darkness. Yet on many a night, the wagon stopped outside strange houses. The muffled voices resumed. I solicit your ears. Oversee the oven's order. Dig up all that is illustrious. Its rawness will enchant you someday. Blindfolded, I cross the border. Still, I look back. The final poem that I'll read from this collection is, this is page 110. And this is the moment in his life where he stopped titling his poems because he felt it was impossible to accord any title to a poem. And I think this also has a history dating back to Rabindranath Tagore. I think it's there in the introduction. I found out the letter that Tagore wrote to one of his friends explaining why should no poet ascribe a title to a poem. And the reason that Tagore says is that it is almost illegal to, because we don't know, when a poem comes to you, hardly do we know what it is about until we write that down. So Dasgupta never read that before he took that decision. But when we had the conversation, when I was recording him, he remembered that, and he told me that this was much later that he read that even Tagore thought that we shouldn't ascribe titles to poetry. And he felt that sometimes he forcibly, for the earlier collections, he forcibly ascribed titles to the poems, even though they could be just, computations and combinations of thought as such. So anyway, this poem is titled Poem 26. Because it follows a kind of structure. Amidst crisis, times of clash, you too stay silent. In sleep and sense, amidst obscenities, expunge your palms. Then the garrulous grows still impeccably white. Your resignation is the key to outer space. Who can envision the thought of a fleshy matter flies faster than a cotton plant? Without fire, a cigar burns oneself. A painting desires to touch, its eyelids quiver. I listen to the buzz of ants.
Yes. Thank you so much for the beautiful rendition of the poems, and the floor is open to the panelists. The thought on the work you just read.
I also picked up on this idea, and like you said something in the introduction that I found interesting. I said, I read the titles as introductory cryptograms to the poems. And it's an interesting, I think it's an interesting comment to make how they, and I totally agree that the title can totally anchor the meaning of the poem. So in a way, getting rid of the title makes reading freer, you know? And that's not something you can do, I guess, with a short story. You can have a short story that's untitled. It's reading for my kids' test, you know, they have all these things about the short story. Here's a quiz on Tuesday, so I have to help them. But anyway, it just kind of came as a contrast in my mind, you know, that the poems you can easily just leave untitled or title them with numbers, which is sort of similar. But a question that came to my mind here is, you know, in your translation, there are things with English that don't sound right, and I'm going to assume that that's because of Bengali also. He's doing things with language in Bengali that he's stretching the limits of it. So that's always a risk with translation because, you know, somebody who doesn't know might be wondering, well, is this that the translator made a mistake or is this deliberate? So that's, I think, an important, you know, I wanted to sort of ask you about that. How do you handle passages where you think, oh, you know, this is on the verge of being grammatical or not, or being natural or not? And how do you, you know, really signal to your reader that, yeah, indeed, this is what the author is doing in Bengali?
Yeah, I don't know if I could at all signal to my reader except that I can talk about my process, because each poem that I translated at least had 7 to 8 drafts and simultaneous drafts. So I translated, say, one poem 8 or 9 times, and then I would read and let my ears decide if this is really flowing in English well, because there are certain decisions that I took where I tweaked in a word or two here and there so that at least it becomes fathomable to the English-speaking audience. Because if I'm not doing that, I'm doing also disservice to people who are reading this poetry in a way. So I think those were very fine decisions, first about my process of having several drafts, reading them over time, keeping them, letting it, you know, germinate in what it would be, and then I would take my final call with my ear, when I would read and I would feel as someone whose first language is Bengali, is it also making sense in Bengali to me? If it's yes, I would go ahead with that. So sometimes you might find, I really took a lot of effort in putting words at least on a formal level as they were on the page. I didn't do anything about that. I also didn't take out, say, a comma, which doesn't really, you know, is not grammatically correct in English, but that's what he did it in Bengali. So I put it like that because I think that talks a little bit about the disjointedness and the flow, but also spaces where he would not want it to flow. Because the syntax in Bengali and the syntax in English are almost diametrically opposite to each other, and it is impossible to bring them together in the language, at least, that I'm translating. So yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
about
for
this?
sure.
This is basically my third question.
Okay.
So I feel like I did a good job.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, but sorry, I was going to just ask for Prof's opinion on something she brought up concerning the translation and maybe it being a gap in translation or something like that. So I wanted to know maybe your opinion on the extent a translation could be independent of the original, whether it's something that could stand on its own right, or...
This is kind of what I was going to ask.
Oh, there you are. There you are.
In your translator's note, you talk about the quote I've written down. While translating Dasgupta, I realized that foreignness sometimes must be treated as given like an object that cannot be pulverized, which made me think about like when I read translators talking about the act of translating, that there's always something in the text that like doesn't quite carry over. And so like you're left with this choice, like you have to either compromise somehow or be inventive, which makes me think of like Aaron Moray. So Aaron Moray has this essay about fidelity versus felicity. And so fidelity being like a kind of the idea that translation should be this one-to-one translation of the meaning of a text from one language to another. And she argues that that's not possible. And so she argues for this felicity, like the moment when you, like Eureka, you understand the text, but the way you understand the text is you have to like almost like, you have to do something unintended to it. And her solution, and she's translating Fernando Pessoa, and she translates him, not only in terms of language, but she translates his poems into the streets of Toronto, There's a kind of drastic kind of translation where she captures the spirit of the text, but not always the meaning. Some of the meaning is invented. So I wanted to ask you, in relation to this, what do you do with those moments that are kind of like untranslatable? Like, is there a kind of felicity involved where you hear something and have to kind of go on your gut? Like, and do something maybe that isn't 100% what's in the original?
Yeah, I believe so. I think I'll just let it be. So you will find at the end of the book, there's a glossary of the terms I could not translate. And I put it that way. And not to defend myself, but I was reading Paul Ritter on translation yesterday because I just wanted to, have some preparation going in. And I pulled out a few words which might help us to unpack some of the thoughts that we have. So he says that a translator must renounce the dream of return to some adamantine logos of pure correspondence. So I think there is no pure correspondence between languages, and probably that's what impossibility is about. That it's difficult to do a word-to-word translation, and that is why I would prefer using a term like thought translation, which really helped me.
Thought
Translation. In a way, what Dasgupta wanted to say in words that I couldn't translate, I tried to, have a thought about that word. Maybe it's not like a direct literal translation. I wish, people knew Bengali and I could really, demonstrate that here, but it's not possible. So, it's not a word-to-word translation, and there are times where I really had to listen to my gut of what it could be. And I wish there was a cognate word in English. So that would be a happy space for me. But I believe that translation is also this correspondence between the self and the stranger who can never be avoided. And I had to, in a way, accept that English is the language. I would not say it's a stranger to me anymore, but it's almost a stranger that I cannot avoid. But I will have to chat. And I'll have to talk, and that's the point of ethics. I think that I was trying to have a sense of ethics, a cyclical quality about translation that I really almost embodied myself when I was doing this, because I was very well aware of loss because I was already translating, but I never published any of my translations, before this. But it is also a happiness to overcome that sense of strangeness. And it's a gift, I think, as Professor Dasgupta was talking about in one of the conversations. And there is mourning, but there is also gift. And probably it's a gift of mourning.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
On the note of strangeness and foreignness and ethics? So in your note on translation, which is beautifully written, by the way, and the last paragraph I just love very much. If you feel like reading anything else out loud, I'd suggest that. But you have a lexicon for translation in those passages where you use the words limit, loss, threshold, foreignness, responsibility, ethics. And what struck me about that was this is the lexicon of Derridian deconstructive ethics, of hospitality. So I know you turned to monolingualism of the other, which makes sense in talking about translation. But for me, what resonated was the ethics of hospitality as an ordinate for thinking about the relationship between author and translator. And for Derrida, unconditional hospitality he uses this to confront Kant's notion of conditional hospitality, in which the idea is whoever shows up at your door, you let them in, you don't demand their name, you give them space, you give them food, you give them shelter. That is unconditional hospitality. Conditional hospitality is where it's Airbnb, there's an exchange, or there are laws that the person has to follow when they come into your home. And what he describes is the space of indeterminacy in the relationship between host and guest that can never be reconciled fully, and that therefore, because it is indeterminate, is a space of ethics. This is where we practice ethics, and for him it's the supreme notion of what an ethical relationship requires, is that space between the conditional and the unconditional. And I heard that so loudly in your translation, was this ethics of hospitality. So I guess my question for you would be, does that resonate for you? Is that a way to think about what's going on here?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think so. I think politics of hospitality is so interesting in the context of translation, especially someone like Dasgupta, who is like so difficult to translate. He resisted translation so many times, and there were so many poems I just had to leave out because it was not making sense in English anymore. So, and I feel the politics of hospitality and unconditional hospitality is one of the ways we can understand this relationship of the self and the stranger, one language in relation to the other language, because Bengali is so foreign to English and English is so foreign to Bengali. But I am, in a way, bringing them, I don't know if it is forcibly, but as amicably as possible at the brink of a language in which that transference is possible. And I believe that that's probably the high point of hospitality, unconditional hospitality. Yes.
I wanted to, as they say, circle back to that question that you had about the status of the translation versus the original or source and target and so on, and to maybe invite you to explore the work and give you a term to think about and get away from this idea of loss is transcreation. The Brazilian poet and theorist and translator Haroldo de Campos created this whole philosophy around translation that, first of all, the only things that are worth translating are the untranslatable things. Because why bother with something that's easy, right? And that because it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge, but it's a challenge that affords you, great satisfaction and the ability to create. So of course, the opposite of loss is gain. People always say that there's loss, but there could also be gain. Each language has its own genius or ethos or however you want to call it, and there's things you can do in English that you probably can't do in Bengali, right? So that's another way of thinking about it, where it's like, okay, how can I exploit the resources of English to give Dasgupta his best shot at getting his message across, or his poetry across. So I would say that's a way of perhaps balancing this sort of melancholia that translators feel. So yeah, just wanted to throw that in there.
No, I think I really agree with you. And transcreation was something that was at the back of my head, not as a term as such, but something that I was struggling myself. So one of the ways I wanted to do that was to have similar sounding words. So for example, in page 45, the poem that I read, it was, from the last it's fifth, is when amidst the smoke your lamenting face is lucid. So I wanted to have that sound of la, 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 even though that's not there in Bengali, but that creates a sense of poetry in this disjointedness. So that is my element of, probably if I can use your word, transcreation, because I wanted to put that sound, there. Yeah.
I think that view on transcreation just something that seems to echo the word performance in relation to translation. And I think when you begin to say translation as a kind of performance of the original, it tends to accord the translated version some kind of independence, because it makes it appear like an individual response to the original. And it's also what creates the room for different translations of the original. Because I think there was a time, this question of the source and the copy and the original version, like those who don't have access to the original version of a work, whether reading translated copy or version of it, they could say they have already mastered the work. Like how you could sever the relationship. For us who don't have access to Bengali, for instance, I may never get to learn Bengali to read the original version, right? So, but this tends to become a poem or poetry in its own right, sort of. And most of the poems I read in my undergraduate studies, they're all in translation, right? And I never got to read the original version, and they're all poems. So when you begin to think of translation as a performance, a kind of realization, just the way maybe you can have a filmic adaptation of a novel, right? So we know that there are those closer to the original, so to speak, but then they are still something that could stand on their own right and tend to make sense. And apart from the fact that they make the work available to a wider audience, for those who are encountering the work through translation, I think they just meet it as a work of its own kind. Like reading this poem, for instance, I can't be imagining what the original could look like in Bengali, except there are some kind of clues, something that keep pointing me to Bengali, because just the way we read some other works already in Anglophone, like already in English language, right? So I feel like every translation is a sort of a performance of the original, or your word, transcreation of the original.
Okay, thank you for your input. Yes, we still have like two faces before we, say it's a day. So I will ask our translator and our poet and our writer to actually engage the lyrical essay she wrote, and perhaps respond to how that lyrical essay, helps us to explore the idea of loss and impossibility.
Okay, all right.
In some way. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, for sure. So I'll first talk a little bit about the title of the essay that I wrote, which is I may be hidden but not invisible. So there is an expectation, at least in the culture that from which I translated, that a translator should be hidden to the extent of not being visible. And I think that was quite a demanding task, and I couldn't agree to that kind of formal setup. So I had a take on that, which I'll read. This is page 121 in the book. So for those who translate with life and texts, we essentially become the people in Plato's allegory of the cave. We like it or not, we spent our lives chained to the cave of our first language. But we also face a blank wall where we watch shadows of all other languages, we give names to them, we learn, we repeat, we imitate, we translate. But often the translator faces a fate more miserable than the shadows in Plato's allegory of the cave. In the contemporary literary scene, there is a general expectation that a translator ought to be a nameless author invisible to the world, that the medium should mellow down. And if a translator ever makes her presence felt, the book may have to face the ramifications. In the work of translation, I understand the poet and the translator as coming together to meet at the cusp of languages. They embrace each other's position and acknowledge the liminal space of the cusp. It may be the case that a translator may occasionally have to hide, but that should not render her invisible. To desire her invisibility is a symptom of literary and social prejudices. If the physical visual visibility of the text is not a testament of presence, is the effacement a story of her absence? So, and that was something that I was thinking about. Of course, this is poetry by Mridul Dasgupta, but I would, there is no point that I'm expropriating his voice, and that a translator, especially if she's a woman, sometimes there are demands that she should mellow down and she should not put her name under, certain banners, and just that. I'm very glad that I could translate him, and my poet, he almost celebrates my presence, and he never had that, but at least in the literary culture where I shared my work, for feedback of this essay, they said that perhaps I should mellow myself down. So I should let people know that what you're reading now as introduction and a lyric essay was first one single introduction. But the feedback that I got is, for someone who's reading Dasgupta for the first time, would probably want to know him much more than me, which is, I think, fair. on many parts, but I also feel that I do have something to talk about. What is my process, what I did, and why I chose to translate it. And I already have a dissertation to write, and of course other things. But I really do deeply care for this work. So that's my take on gender, and which connects well to impossibility in a way. And I want to read that a little bit. And this is page 125 at the very end. To encounter a limit is to be uprooted. To be uprooted is to encounter loss. The loss is real. While shifting from one dwelling to another, I faced a disjunct. It is loss uncompensated. I let it engulf me. I translated with an awareness of loss. The loss is the witness to impossibility. If I had challenged it, I would have failed. It is what makes translation possible. It dictates translation. As a translator, I am bound by the loss that I cannot evade. I am implicated in the loss because I am not outside language. I ran through Bangla to reach the other shore, English. To translate is not to let loss touch incoherence. I understand it as a generative restraint. It means to speak the truth without desperation. At least the pleasure sprang from translating desubjectivized poetry. For the most part, I was not bound to a name or a title. Without a name or a subject, sometimes loss becomes bearable. I read Jacques Derrida's lyrical statement in monolingualism of the other or the prosthesis of origin to be an epitome of loss. I have one language, it is not mine. But if I am divested of the language, the only conduit through which I speak, I ask, how can I speak without owning it? When I encounter loss, do I deny ownership? When I translate Mridul Dasgupta with the experience of loss, grief spills to the other shore. But Derrida catches me off guard, and I am at a loss again when he asks, I am listening. What is the meaning of this attestation you are claiming to sign? I kept wondering if this question was for a nameless author who had the option either to hide or to be invisible.
Thank you so much. Please let's we'll take it from the panelists, what they feel about the lyrical essay, and then we can open the floor to the audience and your questions about the book, what you notice, and what you feel. What's your impression of this work? How is it different from other translations you have read? So yeah, we'll take it from the panelists, then we can shift to the audience.
Thank you for sharing that. I think I've kind of said my piece a bit on translation, but I am a little bit curious. So you talked about writing this to an audience where they might situate their Dasgupta in relationship to what they know from their other traditions. And for me, I kept coming back to things like language poets, and for Lynn Hedginian primarily, and her thoughts about the new sentence and the open text as she describes it. So I see kind of open field poetics at work here, and all of the politics that go with that. So the idea of the political being, or the social being there in the background constantly, even when some of the settings are quite domestic or individual in different ways. And so I had all these resonances with his contemporaries in the United States and Canada primarily, and that's how I came to reconcile my relationship with the poet. But I'm wondering how you understand Dasgupta within the tradition from which he comes, about which I know nothing. Like, so would he be understood? The language poets often situated themselves in opposition to official verse culture, was the classic term, right? Mainstream poetry that was highly lyrical, expressivist, and that was in many ways just comfortable poetry for comfortable people, as opposed to a politicized poetry that distrusted that lyric subjectivity and, you know, the military march of good grammar, right? And so how do you think about this within his own milieu of poetic creation? Is he a radical poet? Is he a conventional poet? Is that too much of a pinning down of his practice for you to even ask that question?
No, I feel that's a very important question to ask, because I have never, like the verse, of course he likes himself to be placed as someone writing post Jibanananda Das. So there is of course a Tagore tradition, right? So Jibanananda Das was writing at a time after Tagore. He was a contemporary but quite young. And Mridul Dasgupta is writing post Jibanananda, so he talks about that. But I have never read, even in Bengali, such beautifully image arresting, disjointed poetry, at least of his generation. So he is radical in a lot of ways, but not very direct. He has this indirect, slithering sense of being a radical, but never letting that out, except what we read in his poetry. There is one poem that I didn't translate, but I think that was in response to some of the crisis in the Middle East at that time. And he wrote, like, the last line of one poem, if I translated it, it's like, I am Mridul Dasgupta and I support all the guerrilla warfare happening. And when I asked him, he was really embarrassed. He said, I was young, don't worry, don't worry about that. So, but I feel that there is a radical sense in his poetry that is quite unmatched in the generation that he belonged to. Of course, there were people like Bhaskar Chakraborty and Pranabindu Dasgupta, who are somewhat translated in English, and I would request everyone to kind of go back to their work to get the sense of silence. So Bhaskar Chakraborty is all about silence and making the silence speak, but Dasgupta is more about having silence, having speech, having disjointedness, and making an image out of it. Say, for example, in this collection, there's a poem called Samudragupta and his Veena, which is like, Samudragupta is a king, he has his Veena, which is the musical instrument, but he imagined that to be the nervous system of a body, tying the head to the toe, and on all the structures going. So I feel he's a radical, even though he doesn't accept it outrightly that he is.
All right.
Yeah, so I have a couple of points that I just, some things that came up. So one is, you said, I want you to maybe explain this. You said at some point that you to translate, you let myself be wounded by words. I quite like that, and I was wondering what you meant by that. So that's one question. And then the other question is, you mentioned Octavio Paz, right? As one of your, in the introduction, one of the poets who was translated. You said that there's a kind of an international group of poets who were translated into Bengali, like Nicanor Parra, for example. I was quite amazed by that, a Chilean poet, and Octavio Paz. Octavio Paz lived in India for many years. He was the ambassador of Mexico, and he was also very interested in Indian poetry and culture, and so, do you know anything about how he's perceived? Did he have any relationship with other poets or writers from India? Like Dasgupta was probably very young at the time there, but I'm just wondering, if there was any connection there.
Yeah, one thing that I can say for sure that Nicanor Parra, he was translated, and he had great friendship with a poet, writer, critic, Manovendra Bandyopadhyay, so they were friends, and Nicanor Parra did come to Calcutta once, that I'm very sure about. I'm not sure if Dasgupta had any connection to some of the poets who are translated in Bengali. He might have been very, very young, but there is a bustling tradition of Latin American poets being translated in Bengali, and recently I think this book is taken up by an English department in Latin America to do a translation, a secondary translation. So I see that kind of tradition. I don't know much about it, but I see that interesting connection that Bengal had with, and also with some American poets like Allen Ginsberg. He had, he came to Calcutta a few times and was friends with the younger generation that grew up, including Shokti Chattopadhyay, Sunil Gangopadhyay. So that kind of transcontinental friendship was always there. But what strikes me is so much of Latin American poetry and Russian poetry. Indians, they were very fascinated by Russian poetry. They have been translated in Bengali, but the opposite has not happened. Bengali poetry has not been translated as much as it should have been in English or maybe in other languages. I don't know the reason as such, but I wish we had more contact.
Now you have started the job.
Oh. Okay, yeah, yes.
Yes, so the floor is open to the audience. If you have questions for Anindita, impression of our work, we can ask. And then we have books. If we don't have a copy yet back there, please go ahead and pick a copy to encourage us. Writers are generally poor, so if you buy the books, encourage them. So, yeah, thank you so much. Yes, if we don't have a question or we want to chat, okay, yeah, please.
So I just got the book, so I haven't read it carefully, but I noticed that in a number of the poems, there may be like one random word that is left in the original, I presume in Bengali, or maybe it might be in Sanskrit, or whatever. I mean, in a Romanized version, and then you have this nice glossary in the back, which is beautiful. I just wonder, when I was just reading the poems that we read today, and those words appear, kind of for me, personally, others may have different reactions, kind of sort of simultaneous, kind of an alienating effect, because it calls attention to the foreignness for the English-speaking reader, but also kind of brings us closer to the culture and the original, because it's the unmediated word itself. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about those words that appear. It's often only one word in a poem, or maybe two, but not more than that usually. And it's a fairly large number of poems that's like that. And how that is either similar to or different from the effect in the original, the poems in the original language.
Yeah, I can definitely do that for sure. I think for some of the words that I couldn't translate, I left it in the original, and I thought a glossary would help people in understanding what they are and maybe add some more sense. And that is probably how one will feel close to a word that they don't know, but have an accompanying meaning which will help them know about it. But I can definitely find the poem. Say, for example, let me find. This is a small poem. This is page 39, and it reads, "Encounter. It will rain heavily. It may rain. It should rain. Its amber ring is called foam, charred smell. Beni Babu at the wall smoke. The ration card reserved. There lies a stack of women's hair. Poetry has become silly. Like a nitwit, I notice all that I lose daily." So you will see silly and daily, they rhyme. They also rhyme in Bengali. So I've tried very hard to have rhymes wherever I could. There were quite a few instances I could not, because that was possibly not possible. But say Beni Babu at the wall smoke. So Beni Babu is, it's a calendar that we use for, say, marriage, getting the perfect date and time for a marriage, or for an auspicious occasion. That could be a rice ceremony, that could be marriage, and every Bengali household we have that pink colored book that we keep it. We call it pulonga, which is we have a small probably a rectangular structure, a hollow inside the wall, where we keep our stuff. Maybe a clock. My grandfather used to keep a clock, including the Beni Madhav Shiler Ponjika. So which is it's a calendar of Beni Madhav Shil, who was probably the person associated with it. And so we keep it there. So what he is doing, he's looking at an everyday setting of a Bengali household, and he's making poetry out of it. So even I thought Beni Babu to be one of the literary characters. Of course, there is a literary character in Bengali literature called Beni Babu, but he corrected that. So this is where I went wrong. But when I went to him, he said, no, this is not the Beni Babu that I want to meet. So you should, pin yourself down to the exact Beni Babu. I said, okay, fine, tell me then. Then, he told me that it's about the calendar that we use, to find auspicious day for some of the things we value, like marriage, rice ceremony, thread ceremony, even the lunar calendar, like when it's like a full moon, when it's the new moon, because we have small festivals happening, on those specific days. The alignment of the stars, so it's quite astrological and astronomical in a way, and that's what Beni Babu is about. I don't know if there's something in the North American tradition. There might be.
Farmer's Almanac.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So something like that. So you see, even though we are quite far from the tradition, but maybe if we have like something like a farmer's almanac that kind of connects us, that probably we are not as stranger as we feel we are. So that's my take. Thank you for the question.
Thank you for the question. Any other question from the audience? Okay, it's a beautiful day. Thank you so much once again for coming and for, thank you to the panelists as well. All of you contributed and I learned a lot from the beginning of Anindita's work. And thank you for writing, for translating the book, and making it available for someone like me who can speak Bengali, right? So we can also pick up the chat once we move from our desk, from our chairs, and have some cookies over there, coffee is in the jar there, and then we have a lot of stuff there. There's kind of choice for us. And then books at the back there as well. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
No, translators, visibility.